Give Patton my words. I was wrong. His Black Battalion just saved Third Army.
November 7th, 1944. Dawn breaks over the foggy hills of Morville-lès-Vic, France. The ground shakes as 54 M4 Sherman tanks roar to life, their tracks churning the freezing mud of the Lorraine campaign. This is the 761st Tank Battalion. They are attached to the 26th Infantry Division of General Patton's Third Army, and they are moving directly into the kill zone of the German 11th Panzer Division. The men inside these 30-ton machines know the statistics. The life expectancy of a tank crew in this sector is measured in days, sometimes hours, but for the 761st, the pressure is double. They are the first African-American armored unit in U.S. history to enter combat. The War Department's own reports claimed these men lacked the technical intelligence to operate complex machinery. They claimed they would break under fire. Every shell they load, every coordinate they call out, is a direct answer to those reports. Just days earlier, General George S. Patton had stood before them. He didn't offer a pep talk. He gave them a grim ultimatum. He looked at their commander and said, "I don't care what color you are as long as you go up there and kill those Kraut sons of bitches. Everyone has their eyes on you and is expecting great things from you. Most of all, your race is looking forward to your success. Don't let them down." Now, the speeches are over. In the lead tank of Company A sits Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers. He is 23 years old, from Tecumseh, Oklahoma. As his tank crests a ridge, the air suddenly splits with the screech of incoming artillery. German 88mm anti-tank guns, hidden in the tree line, open fire. The ground erupts. The Black Panthers are no longer an experiment. They are targets. And Sergeant Rivers is about to show the Third Army exactly how a black soldier fights when his back is against the wall. But before we dive in, tell me where you're watching us from. And may God bless you wherever you are. Now, let's begin. The first thing you notice inside an M4 Sherman tank during combat isn't the noise, it's the smell. It is a suffocating mix of diesel fumes, sweat, and the sharp metallic tang of cordite. As the 761st pushed forward into the teeth of the German defenses near Morville-lès-Vic, that small steel box became their entire world. The fighting was ferocious. The Germans had pre-sighted their artillery on the roads, turning the approach into a carnival of destruction. But the men of the 761st did not freeze. They adapted. They learned quickly that the Sherman's 75mm guns struggled to penetrate the thick frontal armor of German Panthers, so they used speed and aggression. They flanked. They fired white phosphorus to blind the enemy gunners. The white soldiers of the 26th Infantry Division, hunkered down in foxholes, watched in disbelief. They had heard the rumors that black troops would run at the first sign of trouble. Instead, they saw the Black Panthers driving their tanks directly into enemy fire to suppress machine gun nests that had pinned the infantry down for hours. One infantryman later wrote home about seeing a black tank commander pop his hatch open in the middle of a mortar barrage to get a better look at a sniper position. It was a level of professional courage that didn't need translation. By the time the sun set on those first few days of combat, the 761st hadn't just taken ground, they had taken the respect of the men fighting beside them. But confidence can be dangerous. As they pushed deeper into the Lorraine campaign, the weather worsened and the German resistance stiffened. They were heading toward a small, heavily fortified town called Guebling, and the cost of entry was about to become personal. It was November 16, 1944. The road to Guebling was a muddy strip of death, heavily mined and covered by German anti-tank guns. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers was leading the way in the lead tank, A Company 1. He knew the risks of being on point. If there was a mine, he would find it first. And he did. A massive explosion rocked his Sherman, blowing the tracks off and slamming the 30-ton vehicle into a ditch. Inside, the violence was absolute. Rivers was thrown against the steel interior. His leg was slashed open from the knee down, a jagged, bone-deep wound that was bleeding profusely. His crew dragged him out into the snow-dusted mud. The pain must have been blinding. Captain David Williams, the company commander, rushed over with the medics. They took one look at the leg and shook their heads. The bone was visible. This was a $1 million wound, a guaranteed ticket home. The medics prepared a morphine injection and brought a stretcher. The war, for Reuben Rivers, should have been over right there. But Rivers pushed the morphine needle away. He looked at Captain Williams, his face gray with shock, but his eyes hard as flint. He said, "Captain, you're going to need me. This is my battalion. I'm not leaving them." He refused the stretcher. He refused the evacuation. Instead, he ordered his men to help him limp to a replacement tank. He climbed into the commander's seat, clamped his headset over his ears, and radioed that he was ready to advance. For the next 3 days, fighting through an infection that burned like fire, Sergeant Rivers didn't just stay in the fight, he led it. By the morning of November 19th, the agony in Rivers's leg had to be unbearable, but the situation outside the tank was worse. The battalion was stalled outside Gwebling. German Panzerfaust teams and heavy guns were hidden in the morning mist, picking off American vehicles one by one. The advance had ground to a halt. Rivers knew that if they stayed still, they would die. He saw the muzzle flashes of the German anti-tank guns in the distance. He grabbed his radio. "I see 'em," he told his platoon. "We've got to draw their fire so the rest of you can target them." Against every survival instinct, Rivers ordered his driver to move his tank into the open. He exposed his position to bait the Germans. It worked. The enemy guns turned toward him, revealing their locations to the other American tanks. Rivers fired round after round, destroying at least 2 German positions. But the gamble had a price. 2 high-explosive shells slammed into his turret. The radio in the command tank went silent. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers was gone. A silence fell over the radio net, followed immediately by a roar of fury. The men of the 761st didn't mourn in that moment. They attacked. Driven by a cold rage over the loss of their leader, the battalion surged forward and hammered the German defenses, capturing Gwebling and driving the enemy out. They had proven their point, but the celebration was short-lived. High Command didn't give them time to rest. Reports were coming in from the north, terrifying reports. The German army had launched a massive surprise offensive in the Ardennes forest. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, and the 761st was being summoned to the fire. December 1944 changed everything. The 761st was pulled from the mud of France and ordered to race toward Belgium. This was a logistical nightmare. They traveled over 100 miles in open-topped vehicles, driving through blizzards that turned roads into sheets of ice. The men had no winter camouflage. Their olive-drab tanks stood out like targets against the white snow. They lacked proper winter boots, and frostbite became an enemy as dangerous as the Germans. As they moved north, they saw the debris of a retreating American army, abandoned jeeps, discarded equipment, and exhausted soldiers moving the other way. The Germans had punched a massive hole in the Allied lines, and the 761st was being thrown in to help plug the gap near a critical road junction. The transition was brutal. They went from fighting in claustrophobic French villages to the wide, frozen forests of the Ardennes. The cold was so intense that machine guns jammed and tank engines refused to start unless they were kept running all night. When they finally arrived in the sector west of Bastogne, The situation was chaotic. Nobody knew exactly where the German lines were. The enemy here wasn't the conscript army they had faced earlier. These were SS Panzer Divisions, desperate and well-equipped. The 761st was attached to the 87th Infantry Division with a simple order: stop them. And the focal point of that order was a small, unassuming Belgian town named Tillet. Tillet was a fortress. Nestled in a valley and surrounded by high ground, it controlled the main supply road to Bastogne. If the Americans couldn't take Tillet, the Germans could continue to strangle the surrounded 101st Airborne. The Germans knew this, and they had dug in deep. On January 8, 1945, the 761st rolled into position to support the 87th Infantry's assault. The snow was knee-deep. The sky was a low gray blanket that grounded Allied air. Support. It was a fight on the ground, steel against steel. The German tanks, Panthers and Tigers, were painted white to match the snow. They were invisible until they fired. As the 761st advanced across the open fields toward the town, the trap was sprung. Armor-piercing shells tore through the air. Several Shermans were hit instantly, bursting into flames that melted the surrounding snow into black slush. The infantry was pinned down, unable to move without being cut to ribbons by machine gun fire. For 2 days it was a stalemate. The 761st was low on ammunition. Their tanks were battered. The crews were surviving on frozen rations and almost no sleep. The command came down from headquarters. Tillet must be taken at all costs. They were running out of time, and the German grip on the town was tightening. They needed a miracle, or a maneuver so crazy the Germans wouldn't expect it. The assault on Tillet wasn't just a battle. It was a slow-motion collision of desperate men and frozen machines. By the morning of January 10th, the temperature had dropped so low that the oil in the Sherman tanks' recoil mechanisms had turned into a thick, useless sludge. The gunners had to manually hand-crank their turrets, fighting against gears that felt like they were set in concrete. Outside, the infantrymen of the 87th Division were wrapped in everything they could find: curtains looted from bombed-out houses, burlap sacks, layers of newspaper, just to keep their blood moving. The order came to advance. The plan was a brute force push. The 761st would lead, acting as moving steel shields for the infantry walking behind them. But as the engines roared to life, coughing clouds of black smoke into the pristine white air, the German trap snapped shut again. The enemy had positioned their heavy armor in the basements of ruined houses, creating firing slits that were invisible until the muzzle flash. As the first platoon of Shermans rolled into the valley, the world exploded. A German Panther tank, hiding behind a stone wall, put a high-velocity shell through the lead American tank. The sound was distinct, a terrifying crack thump that every tanker knew in his nightmares. But this time, the 761st didn't pull back. They had learned the hard lessons of the Lorraine campaign. Instead of retreating, the other tanks accelerated. They charged directly at the muzzle flashes, firing their machine guns continuously to suppress the German infantry armed with Panzerfaust rockets. Inside the tanks, the crews worked with a frantic, rhythmic precision. The loaders, sweat pouring down their faces despite the sub-zero temperatures, heaved 75mm shells into the breech blocks. The commanders screamed targets over the intercom, their voices fighting the roar of the engines. "Gunner, traverse right! Stone barn! Fire! Fire!" On the ground, something remarkable was happening. The white soldiers of the 87th Infantry, men who might have crossed the street to avoid a black man back in Georgia or Alabama, were now clinging to the hulls of these tanks like they were life rafts. They saw the black crews exposing themselves to fire to protect the foot soldiers. They saw tank commanders popping their hatches to spray 50 caliber fire at German snipers on the rooftops. In the crucible of Tillet, the color line didn't just blur, it evaporated. A bond was forged in that snow that no army regulation could ever dictate. They were simply Americans fighting inch by bloody inch to retake a town that had become the linchpin of the entire sector. By late afternoon, the 761st had physically rammed their way into the village center, their tracks crushing the debris of war, breaking the German hold on the supply route once and for all. When the guns finally fell silent over Tillet, the scene was one of apocalyptic devastation. The snow, once pure white, was now a tapestry of gray ash, black oil, and red blood. The town was secured, the supply line to Bastogne was open, and the German offensive in the Ardennes was effectively broken. But victory felt heavy. The crews of the 761st climbed out of their machines, their faces masked in grime and exhaust soot, looking like weary ghosts. They lit cigarettes with shaking hands, leaning against the warm steel of their tanks, watching as the prisoners were rounded up. The validation of their sacrifice came not in medals, not yet, but in the eyes of the men they had saved. Senior officers from the 87th Division, men who had previously doubted the combat effectiveness of colored troops, walked down the line shaking hands with the black tankers. General Patton himself, who had challenged them to kill the Krauts, eventually reviewed their progress. The 761st hadn't just held the line, they had pierced the German defenses with a ferocity that stunned the planners at Supreme Headquarters. But there was no rest for the weary. The war didn't stop at Tillet. As January turned to February, the 761st joined the massive Allied push into the Rhineland. They became known as a bastard battalion, often passed from one division to another, the 79th, the 103rd, the 17th Airborne. Commanders specifically asked for those black tankers because they knew they delivered results. They faced the Siegfried Line, the Dragon's Teeth, a belt of concrete fortifications protecting the German border. The fighting here was different. It wasn't the fluid maneuver warfare of the Bulge, it was a grind. They blasted pillboxes at point-blank range. They navigated dense forests where every tree could hide an ambush. Through it all, the battalion maintained an operational tempo that was statistically impossible. While white units were rotated off the line for rest and refit, the 761st was kept in combat. They spent 183 consecutive days on the line. Let that number sink in. 6 months of waking up every morning wondering if it was your last. 6 months of eating cold rations, sleeping in the mud, and watching friends die. All while the army they served still debated whether they were equal human beings. By the spring of 1945, the 761st had crossed the Rhine and was driving deep into the heart of the Third Reich. They tore through Germany and into Austria, riding the wave of the Allied victory. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared these men for what they found in May of 1945. The unit was operating near Lambach, Austria, when they encountered the Gunskirchen Lager, a subcamp of the Mauthausen concentration camp complex. As the tanks rolled up to the barbed wire fences, the smell hit them first. A stench of death and decay so thick it made the veteran soldiers gag. When they broke the gates open, they were met by thousands of skeletal figures, victims of the Nazi regime's final solution. It was a moment of profound, shattering irony. Here were African-American soldiers, men who had lived their entire lives under the boot of American segregation, men who knew what it meant to be treated as less than human, now staring into the abyss of ultimate racism. The Jewish prisoners, starving and barely alive, didn't see the color of their liberators' skin. They saw angels in olive drab. The tough, hardened tankers broke down. Soldiers who had destroyed German panzers without flinching wept openly. They emptied their pockets. They gave away their rations, their chocolate, their cigarettes, even their extra clothing to the survivors. One tanker later recalled, "I thought I knew what hate was. I thought I knew what suffering was. But I didn't know anything until I saw Gunskirchen." This encounter steeled their resolve in a new way. They realized that the fight against tyranny wasn't just a political slogan, it was a moral imperative. When the war in Europe officially ended days later, the 761st stood on the banks of the Enns River, linking up with Soviet forces. They had started in the mud of France with everything to prove, and they finished in the heart of Austria as liberators, having destroyed the myth of Aryan supremacy with every shell they fired. The guns stopped, but the struggle did not. The return home for the 761st Tank Battalion was a bitter pill to swallow. There were no ticker tape parades for the Black Panthers. When they stepped off the troop ships in New York, the welcome home signs were quickly replaced by whites only signs as they traveled back to the South. Many of these heroes took off their uniforms and went back to being second-class citizens, working in fields or factories, their incredible deeds absent from the history books and Hollywood movies for decades. It took over 30 years for the country to wake up. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter finally issued the Presidential Unit Citation to the 761st, acknowledging their extraordinary heroism. It was a start, but there was one ghost that still needed to be laid to rest. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers. For 50 years, Rivers's family and his surviving comrades fought for his recognition. They knew what he had done on that road to Göbling. They knew he had sacrificed his life to save his battalion. Finally, in 1997, the injustice was corrected. 7 black veterans of World War II were awarded the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award for valor. Reuben Rivers was one of them. As the citation was read, describing how he refused morphine, how he refused evacuation, and how he fought on one leg until the very end, it wasn't just a medal ceremony. It was a resurrection of the truth. The 761st didn't just fight for America. They fought for the very soul of what America claims to be. They proved that courage has no color. They proved that patriotism isn't about how your country treats you, but about how you treat your country's ideals. Reuben Rivers is buried today in the Lorraine American Cemetery in France, overlooking the fields where he made his last stand. He lies, there among thousands of others, equal in death, just as he was superior in life. His story, and the story of the 761st, is a reminder to all of us. History is not just what is written by the victors, it is what is remembered by the faithful. But before we go, I want to leave you with a question. If you could send a message back in time to Sergeant Rivers in that tank, what would you say? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and God bless.